In the dead silence of a snowy mountain, a scream echoed down the canyon. Not from a gunshot, but from a girl, only 18, tossed like garbage from a cliff. Her crime? Saying no to the town's sheriff. The townspeople watched. Some whispered. None stepped in. But far below, one man saw everything. A rancher with nothing left to lose, and a memory of a silver cross that once belonged to the woman he buried. This is the story they tried to bury in snow. But legends don't stay buried. They say silence in the West ain't just golden, it's currency. The kind of thing folks trade for safety, for comfort, for pretending they don't see what they're looking at. And in the town of Bitter Hollow, silence was bought and sold more than land, cattle, or whiskey. It clung to the buildings like cobwebs, to the church steeple that leaned slightly eastward from too many storms, to the rusted weather vanes that hadn't turned in years despite the constant wind that swept down from the mountains. Bitter Hollow was the kind of place where the wind did most of the talking, and even that had learned to whisper secrets through broken shutters and gaps in door frames. Out here, men didn't shout unless they were drunk, dying, or both. And women, well, most just stopped speaking altogether once they realized no one was listening. Not really listening. Not the kind of listening that mattered, that changed things, that made the world different than it was the day before. The town itself squatted in a valley between two ridges, surrounded by pines that grew too close together and mountains that seemed to press down on everything below, like the weight of unspoken truths. The buildings were weathered gray, their paint peeled away by decades of wind and neglect. Wooden sidewalks creaked underfoot, and the main street was nothing more than hard-packed dirt that turned to mud whenever the snow melted or the rare rain fell. But it was the people who made Bitter Hollow what it was. Folks who had learned that keeping their heads down and their mouths shut was the safest way to navigate life in a place where power flowed like water down a mountainside. Always toward the lowest point, always toward whoever was strong enough to dam it up and redirect it for their own purposes. The sheriff of that town, a man by the name of Wade Garrison, understood this better than most. He wore silence like a second badge, pinned right next to the one that gleamed on his chest. Never needed to raise his voice, just raised his eyebrows and folks knew what he meant. Tall man, lean like a fence post carved out of bone and shadow. His coat was always clean despite the dust and mud that covered everything else in town. His hat never blew off in the wind, as if even the weather knew better than to cross him. And his boots, polished black leather that sounded like nails tapping a coffin lid every time he walked through the saloon doors. Sheriff Garrison had been in Bitter Hollow for near on 15 years, arriving as a young deputy with ambitious eyes and a quick draw. The previous sheriff, old Tom Brennan, had died under mysterious circumstances. Fell down his own stairs one winter night, they said, though some folks whispered he might have had help with that fall. Garrison stepped into the role naturally, like a man putting on a coat that had been tailored specifically for him. But Sheriff Garrison didn't keep order with kindness or even with justice. No, he kept it with control. Quiet, cold control that seeped into every corner of the town like fog rolling down from the peaks. And what he couldn't control, what he couldn't bend to his will with a look or a word or the subtle threat of violence, he removed. The removal was always clean, always quiet, always accompanied by a reasonable explanation that nobody questioned too closely. Folks who caused trouble tended to leave town suddenly, called away by family emergencies or better opportunities elsewhere. Those who stayed and continued to be problems sometimes had accidents. Falls from horses, encounters with wild animals, sudden illnesses that the town doctor couldn't quite diagnose or cure. But it was the young women who faced the worst of Garrison's attention. Girls who grew up pretty in a town that noticed such things, who caught the sheriff's eye at just the wrong moment in their lives. Some became his willing companions, seduced by the promise of protection and status that came with his favor. Others simply disappeared, their families told they had run off with traveling merchants or decided to try their luck in the big cities back east. That winter, just before the storm that would change everything rolled in from the mountains, a girl named Rose turned 18. She was the daughter of a woman nobody remembered clearly, a traveler who had passed through town one summer, stayed long enough to give birth, and then vanished again like morning mist. The father was anybody's guess, Though there had been whispers and speculation over the years, fingers pointed at various men who suddenly grew uncomfortable whenever Rose's parentage was discussed. She'd been raised by the barkeep's widow, Miss Martha Coleman, a stern but kind woman who had never married again after her husband died in a mining accident 20 years previous. Martha ran a small boarding house on the edge of town, taking in travelers and occasional permanent residents who needed a clean room and regular meals at a fair price. She had taught Rose to read from the few books she owned, to stitch clothing that would last through hard winters, and most importantly, to never walk with her eyes on the ground. A woman who won't look the world in the eye, Martha often said, is a woman who's already given up on herself. Rose had taken that lesson to heart, perhaps too well for a town like Bitter Hollow. She had developed a stare like flint, not fiery or dramatic, but dangerous if struck the wrong way. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black in certain light, and they seemed to look right through whatever pretense or politeness people tried to hide behind. She was tall for a woman, nearly 5.5 feet, with auburn hair that caught the light like copper wire, and hands that were calloused from work, but still graceful when she moved them. Sheriff Garrison had noticed Rose years before she turned 18, of course. A man in his position noticed everything and everyone in a town the size of Bitter Hollow. But it was on her 18th birthday, when she walked through town wearing a blue dress that Martha had sewn for the occasion, that he decided he wanted to own that stare of hers. It started with visits. Him dropping by Miss Martha's porch on lazy Sunday afternoons, claiming he just wanted to check in on the town's citizens, make sure everyone was getting along all right. He'd tip his hat to Martha and ask after her health, comment on how well kept her property was, how much the town appreciated her contributions to the community. And then his attention would turn to Rose. He brought gifts at first, small things that could be explained away as simple kindness. A ribbon from the general store, saying the color reminded him of her eyes. A book of Psalms that he claimed the preacher had recommended for young women seeking moral guidance. Even a pair of gloves that he said were imported from Charleston, far too fine for a girl who worked with her hands, but perfect for someone who deserved better than what Bitter Hollow had to offer. Miss Martha watched these visits from her kitchen window, her hands busy with mending or cooking, but her attention fixed on the man who had too much power and too little accountability. She knew better than to say a word against the sheriff directly. Martha Coleman had lived in Bitter Hollow long enough to understand how quickly words could travel and how dangerously they could be twisted. But she also knew what Garrison's gifts meant, what they represented in a town where nothing was ever truly free. Rose always returned those gifts, sometimes without opening them, leaving them on the porch table where Garrison would find them on his next visit. Sometimes she opened them first, examined them carefully, and then placed them somewhere public. The steps of the church, the counter at the general store, the table by the saloon door where men played cards in the evenings. She never said a word about returning them, never offered an explanation or excuse. She simply made it clear that she wasn't interested in what the sheriff was offering. When word spread through town that Rose McKenna had turned 18, something shifted in the air like the pressure drop that comes before a thunderstorm. The women stopped meeting her eyes when she walked through the general store, suddenly finding great interest in their shopping lists or the quality of the goods on the shelves. The men nodded when they saw her, but no longer tipped their hats or offered the small courtesies they had shown when she was still a child. And the preacher, an old man named Reverend Solomon Cross, with hollow cheeks and a cough that had plagued him for years, took Martha aside after church one Sunday and suggested that perhaps it was time Rose learned her place in the community. God's plan for young women was clear, he said, and it involves submission, obedience, and accepting the protection of godly men who could guide them through life's trials. Lest God teach her that lesson himself, Cross had added, his pale eyes fixed on Martha's face, as if searching for any sign of rebellion or disagreement. Martha had nodded and said nothing, but that night she sat Rose down at their small kitchen table and tried to explain what was happening without actually saying the words that could get them both in trouble. Some storms, Martha said, choosing her words carefully. You can see coming from a long way off, and when you see them, you have choices. You can run, you can hide, or you can prepare to weather them where you stand. Rose had listened quietly, her dark eyes reflecting the lamplight. "And what would you do, Martha?" "I'd fight," Martha said without hesitation. "But I'm an old woman with nothing left to lose. You're young, with your whole life ahead of you. Sometimes running isn't cowardice. Sometimes it's wisdom." But Rose McKenna was not the running kind. The next day, Sheriff Garrison came again. This time, he didn't bring gifts. He came with a proposition, spoken in his careful, measured voice, while Martha pretended to be busy hanging laundry in the backyard, but stayed close enough to hear every word. He would make Rose his wife, he said. Said it like a business transaction, not a romantic proposal. He painted a picture of the protection marriage would offer, the respectability, the security. He spoke of the nice house he could provide, the fine clothes she could wear, the position in the community she would hold as the sheriff's wife. "I've seen too many girls wind up with nothing in this town," Garrison said, his voice carrying just enough implied threat to make his meaning clear. "Girls who thought they could make their own way, who didn't understand how the world really works. I don't want that for you, Rose. You're too fine for that kind of ending." Rose listened to his entire speech without saying a word. She sat on the porch steps, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight as a fence post. When he finished, she looked up at him and smiled. Not kindly, not cruelly, just the kind of smile that says, "You're not worth my no." She didn't say it out loud, didn't need to. Her eyes said it loud enough for any man with sense to hear. Garrison stared at her for a long moment, his jaw working like he was chewing something bitter. Then he touched the brim of his hat, turned on his heel, and walked away. But the sound of his boots on the wooden porch steps told Martha everything she needed to know about what was coming next. That night, Rose couldn't sleep. She stood by her small bedroom window, watching the snow begin to fall from a sky that seemed too low and too dark. The flakes came down slow and soft at first, like ash from a distant fire, but she could sense the weight of the storm building behind them. Martha found her there near midnight, still dressed, still watching. "You should rest," Martha said softly. "I keep thinking about what you said," Rose replied without turning away from the window. "About storms you can see coming." "What about it?" "I can see this one," Rose said, "but I don't think running will stop it from coming. It'll just follow me wherever I go." Martha moved to stand beside her, looking out at the snow that was starting to fall heavier now. "Maybe, but at least if you run, you choose where to make your stand." Rose finally turned to look at her, this woman who had been more of a mother to her than anyone else in the world. "And what if I don't want to run? What if I want to make my stand right here?" Martha reached out and touched Rose's cheek gently. "Then God help us both." In the morning, Martha was gone. Rose woke to find the front door standing wide open, snow blown in across the wooden floor like scattered prayers. The wind moaned through the house, setting loose papers to dancing and making the curtains snap like flags of surrender. Martha's bed hadn't been slept in. Her coat was missing from its peg by the door. Her boots were gone. A note was pinned to the wall beside the door, held in place by a knife that Martha used for cutting vegetables. The paper was already damp from the blowing snow, but the words were still readable. "The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away." Rose read the note 3 times before the meaning really sank in. Then she pulled on her heaviest coat and ran out into the storm. She found Martha 2 days later, after the worst of the blizzard had passed, and search parties could finally make their way through the drifted snow. The body was face down in Willow Creek, about a mile from town, frozen solid and bearing the marks of violence that the cold couldn't hide. Bruises on her throat, cuts on her hands where she had tried to defend herself. A blow to the back of her head that had likely killed her before she ever hit the water. Sheriff Garrison arrived with the search party, his face appropriately grave as he examined the scene. He declared it a suicide, said Martha had been despondent over money troubles, overwhelmed by the responsibility of caring for a girl who wasn't even her blood relation. The note, he claimed, was clearly a farewell message, evidence of a woman who had given up on life and chosen to end her suffering in the freezing creek. Rose called it a message, all right, but not the kind Garrison claimed. That night, 3 men came to the boarding house. They didn't knock, just pushed through the door like they owned the place and everyone in it. Rose was sitting by the fire, still wearing the same clothes she'd worn to search for Martha, still covered in mud and creek water and the smell of death. The men didn't speak much. One of them, a deputy named Hayes who had always looked at Rose like she was something to be consumed, grabbed her arms and pulled them behind her back. Another tied her wrists with rope that cut into her skin. The third man, someone Rose didn't recognize, stood by the door and watched the street to make sure no one interfered. They took her to the back alley behind the saloon, where the snow had been packed down by foot traffic and the high walls blocked most of the wind. A torch burned low in one corner, casting dancing shadows that made everything look like a fever dream. A makeshift platform had been built from wagon boards and wooden crates, like a stage for some terrible performance. And standing atop it, wearing his cleanest coat and his most official expression, was Sheriff Wade Garrison. He didn't smile. He didn't speak for a long moment. He just looked down at Rose like she was livestock being brought to market, his pale eyes moving over her face and body with the calculating gaze of a man who was used to putting a price on things. Finally, he nodded to someone Rose couldn't see, and a voice called out from the shadows, "Starting bid, $3. $3. That's what Rose McKenna was worth to the assembled crowd of men who had gathered in that alley. Less than a good meal, less than a pair of boots, less than a bottle of whiskey, less than the silence the town wanted to keep. She stood there on the auction block in her worn dress, hands bound behind her back, hair tangled from the struggle that had brought her here. Her lip was split and bleeding from where Deputy Hayes had struck her when she tried to fight back, and her breath came out in visible puffs in the cold air. But she didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't beg. Instead, she did something that no one expected. She looked each man in the crowd straight in the eyes, one by one, forcing them to see her not as an object to be bought and sold, but as a human being who refused to be broken by their cruelty. And they looked away, every single one of them, until her gaze finally settled on Wade Garrison. Then she gathered what saliva she could manage and spat directly at his polished boots. The bidding stopped. For a moment, the only sounds in the alley were the crackling of the torch and the wind whistling through the gaps between buildings. Garrison stared down at the spittle on his boots, his face expressionless. Then slowly, he stepped down from the platform. He didn't speak, just nodded again, and the men closed in around Rose like wolves around wounded prey. They loaded her into a wagon that was waiting at the edge of town, her body slumped against the wooden sides like a sack of grain. The ropes around her wrists had rubbed them raw, and the cold was seeping through her thin dress, but she forced herself to stay conscious, to pay attention to where they were taking her. The wagon creaked and bounced as they climbed the mountain trail that led up toward the high passes. Sheriff Garrison rode behind them, his horse's breath creating clouds of steam in the frigid air. His coat flapped behind him like the wings of some carrion bird, and his eyes never left Rose's face. By morning, the snow had deepened considerably. What had been a light dusting the night before was now several inches thick, with more falling steadily from a sky the color of old pewter. The wheels of the wagon left deep ruts in the snow, and the horses struggled with the increasingly steep terrain. At the ridge, a narrow spine of rock that overlooked a sheer drop into the valley below. They stopped. No trial, no verdict, no last words or final prayers. Just the howling of the wind and the endless silence of the mountains. One of the men opened the tailgate of the wagon. Another pulled Rose to her feet, though her legs were so numb from cold that she could barely stand. But she managed it because she wanted to see what was coming. She wanted them to see her face when they did it, to remember what they were doing to another human being. Sheriff Garrison stepped forward then, close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his breath and see the small scar on his chin where he'd cut himself shaving that morning. He placed one gloved hand on her shoulder, leaned in close to her ear, and whispered something that none of the other men could hear. "You could have had everything," he said. "All you had to do was say yes." Then he shoved her hard with both hands, putting all his weight behind it. Rose fell like a stone dropped from a great height, like she had never existed at all. The snow swallowed her scream, swallowed her body, swallowed any evidence that she had ever drawn breath in this world. The wind howled once, long and mournful, then went quiet again. Like Bitter Hollow, where the silence was bought with blood, and the girl who said no was the price. Marcus Sullivan hadn't spoken to a soul in 4 winters. Not since the day he buried his wife and unborn child in graves that were supposed to hold their bodies, but instead held only lies and ashes. His land sat just beyond the black-toothed pines, nestled in a crooked valley where snow came early and left late, where the sun struggled to penetrate the canopy of evergreens that grew so thick they blocked out half the sky. The cabin he called home was a simple affair, rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney that leaked smoke when the wind blew from the wrong direction, windows made from real glass that he'd hauled up from town at great expense years ago when he still believed in the future. It was surrounded by 40 acres of land that he'd claimed during the territorial days, when a man could still make something of himself through hard work and determination. But that was before the lies, before the grief that settled into his bones like winter cold and never quite left, even when spring returned to the mountains. The mountains didn't like people much, and Marcus had come to prefer them that way. After what happened, after what he'd been told happened, he found that solitude suited him better than company. The mountains demanded nothing from him except respect, and they gave nothing back except the harsh beauty of survival. It was an honest relationship, built on mutual understanding, rather than the web of deceptions that seemed to govern human interactions. Folks in Bitter Hollow said he was a ghost, said his wife died and took the best parts of him with her. They weren't entirely wrong, but they didn't know the truth either, not the whole of it. Not the parts that mattered most. They didn't know about the letter he had never opened, the one that arrived 3 days after he'd been told about the fire, a letter addressed to him in handwriting he didn't recognize, with a return address from a town he'd never heard of. He'd held it in his hands for hours, turning it over and over, before finally putting it away in the drawer of his wife's writing desk. It was still there, unopened, gathering dust along with all the other things he couldn't bear to face. They didn't know about the cross he had buried with shaking hands, the silver cross he had carved himself from a broken fence rail during the last week of his wife's pregnancy. She had wanted their child to have something simple and true, not gold or silver or precious stones, but something made with love and hope and the promise of a future that would never come. Or so he had believed, and they sure didn't know that sometimes, at night, when the wind was just right and the moon cast shadows through the cabin windows, Marcus still heard her voice whispering through the walls. Not his imagination, not the product of grief or guilt or too much whiskey. Her actual voice, soft and sweet and impossible, calling his name like she was still waiting for him to find her. The townspeople whispered about him when they thought he couldn't hear, said the isolation had driven him mad, that a man wasn't meant to live alone in the wilderness, like some kind of hermit or wild animal. They said he talked to himself, that he'd been seen having conversations with people who weren't there, that the grief had broken something in his mind that couldn't be fixed. But Marcus wasn't mad. He was just listening for something the rest of the world had forgotten how to hear. Truth had a sound all its own, and it echoed differently in the silence of the mountains than it did in the crowded spaces where people gathered to share lies and call them civilization. Marcus wasn't young anymore, 43 years old with gray threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of too much sun and not enough laughter. But he wasn't old either. He still had strength left in him, though he spent it on chopping wood and keeping wolves away from the fence line rather than on the dreams and ambitions that had once driven him to claim this land in the first place. He didn't pray anymore, not in any formal sense, but he still nodded to the sky before meals and whispered thanks to whatever force had allowed him to survive another day in a world that seemed determined to break everyone who dared to hope for something better. And every now and then, when the moonlight hit the cabin just right and the shadows fell in familiar patterns, he would take out the locket he had sworn he would never look at again. Inside that locket was a miniature portrait of his wife, painted by a traveling artist who had passed through Bitter Hollow during their first year of marriage. Clara had been 6 months pregnant when it was painted, her face glowing with the kind of happiness that seemed to radiate from within. She had insisted on having it made, said she wanted their child to know what she looked like when she was carrying them, to understand that they had been wanted and loved before they ever drew their first breath. That locket was the only proof Marcus had that Clara had ever existed, that their marriage had been real, that the future they had planned together wasn't just the fantasy of a man who had loved too deeply and lost too much. Everything else, their marriage certificate, the deed to their first home in town, the letters they had written to each other during their brief courtship, had been destroyed in the fire, or so he had been told. That morning, the morning that would change everything, Marcus woke before dawn with a feeling he couldn't name sitting heavy in his chest. It wasn't the usual sadness that greeted him most mornings, the weight of another day that had to be endured rather than lived. This was different, sharper, more urgent, like the feeling a man gets when he knows a storm is coming but can't yet see the clouds. He dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness, pulling on wool pants and a flannel shirt that had seen better years, lacing up boots that he had resoled 3 times rather than ride all the way to town to buy new ones. The cabin was cold. The fire had died down to embers during the night, but he didn't take time to build it back up. Something was pulling him outside, toward the ridge trail that ran above Widow's Pass. He saddled his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Thunder, who had been his companion for the past 6 years. Thunder was getting old, his muzzle gray, and his gait not quite as smooth as it once had been, but he was reliable and sure-footed on the mountain trails. More importantly, he didn't judge Marcus for his silences or his conversations with the empty air. The ride to Widow's Pass took him through some of the most beautiful and desolate country in the territory. Ancient pines towered overhead, their branches so thick they created a canopy that blocked out most of the sky. The air was thin and sharp, scented with pine needles and the promise of snow. Wildlife was scarce this high up, an occasional deer or elk, the rare mountain lion, birds that seemed too small and delicate to survive in such harsh conditions. But it was the silence that Marcus treasured most. Not the dead silence of a tomb or an empty house, but the living silence of a world that existed without the need for human words or explanations. The whisper of wind through pine boughs, the distant call of a hawk circling overhead, the crunch of snow under Thunder's hooves, and the steady rhythm of the horse's breathing. He wasn't riding toward Widow's Pass because he had business there. Marcus rarely had business anywhere these days, preferring to live off what his land could provide, rather than venture into town for supplies or human company. He was riding because something in his gut had twisted during the night, a sensation he'd learned to trust during his years in the wilderness. It had started with a dream, the kind that feels more like a memory than a product of sleep. He had seen Clara standing at the edge of a cliff, her hair whipping in the wind, her arms outstretched like she was trying to catch something falling from the sky. She had turned to look at him, her eyes wide with an urgency he didn't understand, and mouthed a single word: "Come." Then he had awakened, heart racing, the taste of snow and blood in his mouth, though he had eaten nothing and drunk only water before bed. Snow was falling thick by the time he reached the ridge trail, the kind of heavy, wet flakes that accumulated quickly and made travel treacherous. The kind of storm that could erase tracks faster than they were made, that could swallow a man whole if he wasn't careful about where he was going. Marcus pulled his collar high and narrowed his eyes against the wind, trusting Thunder to find safe footing on the increasingly slippery trail. And that's when he heard it. Not a gunshot, not a scream. Something worse. Something that made his blood run cold and his hands tighten involuntarily on the reins. It was the sound of a body hitting snow from a long way up, the wet thud of flesh and bone meeting the earth with too much force behind it. He urged Thunder toward the sound, following instinct and memory, and perhaps something deeper than either. The horse seemed to understand the urgency, picking his way carefully but quickly through the snow-covered rocks and fallen logs that littered the trail. They found the edge of the cliff where the sound had come from, and the tracks in the snow told a story that needed no words to be understood. Wagon wheels cutting deep ruts in the accumulated snow. Boot prints, too many to count but clearly from several different men. Drag marks showing where someone had been pulled against their will. And then, at the very edge of the precipice, smaller footprints that stopped abruptly where the solid ground gave way to empty air. Marcus dismounted and approached the edge carefully, his heart hammering against his ribs like something trying to escape. The drop was steep, nearly 200 feet of sheer rock face that ended in a tumble of boulders and snow-covered pine trees. Too steep for survival, too far for hope. But there, near the bottom of the cliff, Tangled in a bank of powder and broken rock, something was moving. A hand, pale as the snow around it, except for the bright red of fresh blood. Fingers that twitched and grasped at nothing, as if their owner was trying to hold on to life itself. Marcus didn't hesitate, didn't stop to think about the danger or the impossibility of what he was seeing. He was off Thunder's back and scrambling down the cliff face before his conscious mind had fully processed what he was looking at. The descent was treacherous, made worse by the snow and ice that covered every handhold and foothold. More than once he slipped, his boots sliding on frozen rock, his fingers burning from the cold as he gripped whatever purchase he could find. But he reached her. She was twisted like a rag doll that had been thrown away by a careless child, her limbs bent at angles that spoke of multiple broken bones. Her lips were blue with cold, her dark hair was matted with ice and blood, and her dress, what remained of it, was torn and stained with the evidence of violence that had nothing to do with the fall. But her chest was rising and falling, shallow and irregular, but unmistakably alive. And around her neck, somehow unbroken, despite the violence she had endured, hung a silver cross on a thin chain. Marcus stared at that cross for a long moment, his breath coming in short gasps that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of the climb. Because it wasn't just any cross. It wasn't something bought at a general store or crafted by a professional silversmith. It was handmade, rough around the edges, with a small imperfection at the top where the chain attached. An imperfection he remembered making 18 years ago when his hands had been shaking too badly to work the silver properly. It was the cross he had carved for his unborn child. The cross he had placed in Clara's hands when they lowered her coffin into the ground. The cross that was supposed to be buried 6 feet under the earth in the Bitter Hollow Cemetery. But here it was, around the neck of a girl who couldn't be more than 18 years old, who had somehow survived a fall that should have killed her instantly. He looked at her face more closely then, pushing aside the blood and dirt in matted hair to see the features underneath. The high cheekbones, the stubborn jaw, the shape of her nose and the curve of her lips. She looked like Clara, yes, but she also looked like someone else. Someone he had never met but had dreamed about for 18 years. She looked like the daughter he had never had the chance to hold. Marcus wrapped her in his heavy coat, talking to her in the same soft, steady voice he used to calm frightened horses. "Easy now, girl. Easy. I got you. You're safe now. Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." Her eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice, dark brown eyes that seemed to focus on his face with effort that spoke of tremendous will. Her lips moved, trying to form words, and he leaned closer to hear what she was trying to say. "Don't," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Don't take me back." Then consciousness fled from her again, and she went limp in his arms. Marcus didn't hesitate. He lifted her as gently as he could, marveling at how light she felt despite her height. Every movement was agony for both of them. Him because of the strain of carrying dead weight up a nearly vertical cliff face. Her because every jar and bump sent shock waves through what were certainly multiple broken bones. But he managed it. Step by step, handhold by handhold, he carried her up that cliff face like he was carrying the most precious cargo in the world. Thunder waited at the top, stamping nervously and snorting clouds of steam into the cold air. The horse seemed to sense the gravity of the situation, standing perfectly still as Marcus carefully positioned the unconscious girl across the saddle and secured her with rope from his saddlebags. The ride back to his cabin took twice as long as the ride out had taken. Marcus walked beside Thunder rather than riding, one hand always on the girl to keep her from sliding off, the other holding the reins. The snow continued to fall, heavier now, and the wind picked up until it was howling through the trees like something alive and angry. But they made it. Just as full darkness was settling over the mountains, they reached the small valley where Marcus had built his home. He carried her inside, laid her gently on his own bed, and began the long process of trying to keep her alive. He built up the fire until the cabin was almost uncomfortably warm. He boiled water and cleaned her wounds as best he could with the limited medical supplies he kept on hand. He splinted what he suspected were broken bones, using strips torn from his own shirts and pieces of wood from his kindling pile. He forced water between her cracked lips, a few drops at a time, and covered her with every blanket and quilt he owned. And all the while he stared at that cross around her neck and wondered what it meant. Who was she? How had she come to have something that was supposed to be buried with his wife? And why did looking at her face feel like looking into a mirror that reflected not his own features, but Clara's? The answers would come. He knew. But first she had to live. First she had to open those dark eyes again and tell him her name and her story and how she had come to fall from the sky like some kind of broken angel. So he sat beside the bed and waited, listening to her labored breathing and the sound of the wind outside. And for the first time in 4 years, Marcus Sullivan found himself praying, not to any particular god or denomination, but to whatever force in the universe might be listening, might care about the fate of one half-dead girl and one broken-hearted man who had found each other in the wilderness. Let her live, he prayed. Let her wake up. Let her be who I think she might be. And in the depths of that long, cold night, as the fire crackled and the wind howled through the pines, Marcus Sullivan heard something he hadn't heard in 4 years, the sound of hope taking root in his chest like a seed that had been waiting for the right conditions to grow. The storm didn't let up for 3 days. It came down with the fury of something personal, as if the mountains themselves were angry about what had happened on their slopes. Snow piled against the cabin windows until Marcus could barely see outside, and the wind shook the walls with such violence that he wondered if the whole structure might collapse under the assault. But inside, wrapped in warmth and silence, Rose McKenna fought her way back to consciousness like a woman swimming up from the bottom of a deep, dark lake. She woke in pieces, first her eyes fluttering open to see unfamiliar rough-hewn rafters above her, then her ears registering the crackle of a fire and the gentle snoring of a man sleeping in a chair nearby. Finally her body, each nerve ending announcing its presence with sharp reminders of what she had endured. Everything hurt. Her ribs felt like they were wrapped in barbed wire. Her left shoulder screamed when she tried to move it. Her head pounded with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat, and there was a taste in her mouth like copper pennies in snow. But she was alive. Against all odds, against all reasonable expectation, she was breathing and thinking and feeling, which meant she had survived something that should have killed her. The man in the chair stirred as she tried to sit up, his eyes opening immediately as if he had been sleeping with one ear tuned to any change in her condition. He was older than she had expected, maybe 40, with dark hair shot through with silver and lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into the sun. His face was weathered but kind, and when he looked at her, she saw something in his expression that she couldn't quite identify. Relief, certainly, concern, but also something deeper, more complex, recognition. "Easy now," he said, his voice rough with sleep and emotion. "Don't try to move too much. You've got some healing to do yet." Rose tried to speak but found her throat too dry and raw to produce more than a whisper. The man, she still didn't know his name, reached for a cup of water on the table beside the bed and helped her take small sips until she could manage words. "Where am I?" she asked. "My cabin," he replied. "About 10 miles north of Bitter Hollow, up in the high country. Name's Marcus Sullivan." She studied his face, searching for any sign of deception or threat, but found only the steady gaze of a man who seemed to understand something about pain and survival. "How long?" "3 days, Marcus said. "You've been in and out, mostly out. Had me worried there for a while." Rose tried to remember how she had gotten here, but her memories of the past few days were fragmented and confused. She remembered the auction, the wagon ride up the mountain, the feel of Wade Garrison's hands shoving her toward the cliff edge. She remembered falling, the sensation of weightlessness followed by the crushing impact of landing. After that, everything was darkness and pain, and the vague sensation of being carried by someone whose voice promised safety. "You found me," she said. It wasn't a question. "Found you at the bottom of Eagle's Drop," Marcus confirmed. "Shouldn't have been possible for anyone to survive that fall. But here you are." She looked down at herself, taking inventory of the damage. Her left arm was in a makeshift splint, and she could feel tight bandages around her ribs. Someone had cleaned the blood from her hair and face, and she was wearing a man's flannel shirt that was far too large for her. But around her neck, somehow miraculously intact, hung the silver cross that had been her only inheritance from the woman who had raised her. "Martha," she said suddenly, the memory hitting her like a physical blow. "Martha's dead." Marcus nodded gravely. "I heard about that. I'm sorry for your loss." Rose felt tears threaten, but she forced them back. She had learned long ago that crying changed nothing, that tears were a luxury she couldn't afford in a world that seemed determined to break anyone who showed weakness. "They killed her because of me," she said, "because I wouldn't do what they wanted." "What they did to Martha Coleman wasn't your fault," Marcus said firmly. "What they did to you wasn't your fault either. The only people responsible for those crimes are the ones who committed them." Rose looked at him more closely, noting the way his jaw tightened when he spoke about what had happened to her, the anger that flashed in his eyes despite his gentle tone. "Why did you help me? You don't even know me." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something she couldn't see. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, as if he were choosing each word with deliberate care. "Maybe I do know you," he said, "or maybe I know who you should have been if the world had been a kinder place." Rose frowned, not understanding. "What do you mean?" Instead of answering directly, Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and metallic. He held it out to her, and she saw that it was a locket, old and tarnished, but clearly precious to him. "Open it," he said. Rose took the locket with her good hand and managed to work the tiny clasp with her fingernails. Inside was a miniature portrait of a woman with dark hair and kind eyes, painted with the kind of skill that spoke of professional artistry. The woman in the portrait looked exactly like Rose. "That's Clara," Marcus said softly. "My wife. She died 18 years ago, along with our unborn child. Or at least, that's what I was told." Rose stared at the portrait, her heart racing as the implications of what she was seeing began to sink in. 18 years ago," she repeated. "That's when I was born." "Where?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "The missionary station outside Bitter Hollow," Rose said. "Martha told me my mother died in childbirth and my father was unknown. She said the mission took me in and cared for me until I was old enough to come live with her in town." Marcus nodded slowly. "The mission that burned down 3 days after you were born. The fire that supposedly killed both Clara and the baby she was carrying." Rose looked at the portrait again, then at Marcus, seeing the resemblance now that she knew to look for it. The shape of his nose, the stubborn set of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, even when he wasn't smiling. "You think I'm your daughter," she said. "I think you're wearing Clara's cross," Marcus replied. "The one I carved for our child, the one I put in her hands when we buried her, the one that was supposed to be 6 feet underground in the Bitter Hollow Cemetery." Rose touched the cross at her throat, her fingers tracing the rough edges where Marcus had shaped the silver with his own hands. "Martha gave this to me when I was old enough to understand what it meant. She said it belonged to my mother, that it was the only thing she had left behind." "Did she tell you anything else about your mother? About what happened at the mission?" Rose tried to remember, sifting through 18 years of conversations and half-remembered stories. "She said there was a fire, that several people died, including the woman who had given birth to me. But she also said—" Rose paused, frowning as a memory surfaced. "She said the woman had fought to save me, that she had hidden me somewhere safe before the fire reached her." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Hidden you where?" "In the root cellar beneath the mission kitchen. Martha said when they found me the next day, I was wrapped in a quilt and crying, but unharmed. Everyone assumed the woman who saved me had died in the fire, trying to get back to me. But there was no body," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. "No body," Rose confirmed. "Martha said the fire was too hot, that it consumed everything. But now that I think about it—" She trailed off, pieces of a puzzle she had never known existed beginning to fall into place. "What?" "Martha always got strange when I asked about my mother. Sad, but also angry, like she knew something she couldn't say. And sometimes when she thought I wasn't listening, I heard her talking to herself, saying things like, 'They'll pay for what they did, and the truth will come out someday.'" Marcus stood up abruptly and began pacing the small confines of the cabin, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. They told me you were both dead, showed me the burned ruins of the mission, even had a funeral with coffins and everything. I grieved for 18 years, thinking I had lost everything that mattered to me. Rose watched him pace, seeing the anger and pain and desperate hope warring in his expression. But if I am your daughter, if Clara was my mother, then why would they lie? Why go to so much trouble to fake our deaths? Marcus stopped pacing and turned to look at her, his face grim. Because Clara knew something she wasn't supposed to know. Something that would have destroyed powerful people if it ever came to light. What kind of something? The kind that gets people killed, Marcus said. The kind that makes it easier to fake a death than to risk the truth coming out. He sat back down in the chair beside the bed, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of 18 years of deception was finally settling on him. Clara was teaching at the mission school. She worked with the children of the local tribes, trying to help them learn to read and write English while also preserving their own languages and traditions. It was controversial work. A lot of people thought Indians should forget their old ways entirely. Rose nodded. She had heard similar attitudes expressed in Bitter Hollow, where the general consensus was that the only good Indian was one who acted exactly like a white person. But Clara didn't just teach, Marcus continued. She also kept detailed records of what she saw and heard, the conditions at the reservation, the way the government agents treated the native families, the other things that happened to young women who were considered troublemakers or threats to the established order. What other things? Marcus's jaw tightened. The same things that almost happened to you. The same things that did happen to other girls who caught the wrong kind of attention from men with power and no conscience. Rose felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. You think Sheriff Garrison was involved in whatever Clara discovered? I think Wade Garrison has been running the same operation for 20 years, Marcus said, taking young women who have no family, no protection, no voice in the community, and selling them to men who see them as property rather than people. I think Clara stumbled across evidence of what he was doing, and I think he killed her to keep her quiet. But why fake the fire? Why not just make her disappear like he did with Martha? Because Clara was married to me, Marcus said, and I would have torn the territory apart looking for her if she had simply vanished. But a tragic accident, a fire that claimed multiple victims, that was easier to accept, easier to grieve and move on from. Rose was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what Marcus was suggesting. If he was right, if she really was his daughter and Clara's, then her entire life had been built on a lie. Martha Coleman, the woman she had thought of as a mother, had actually been protecting her from the truth. The sheriff who had terrorized her was the same man who had murdered her real mother and stolen her from her father. There's one way to know for sure, she said finally. What's that? Martha's house. If she was keeping me safe all these years, if she knew who I really was, then she would have kept evidence, documents, letters, something to prove the truth when the time was right. Marcus shook his head. Too dangerous. Garrison and his men will be watching the place, waiting to see if anyone comes looking for answers. Then we'll have to be smarter than they are, Rose said, trying to sit up straighter despite the pain in her ribs. I know that house better than anyone. I know where Martha would have hidden things, where she kept her most precious belongings. You're in no condition to be planning raids and adventures, Marcus said firmly. You need time to heal, time to get your strength back. How much time do we have before Garrison realizes I might have survived the fall, before he sends men to search the area and make sure I'm really dead? Marcus considered this, his expression troubled. Not long. A few days, maybe a week if we're lucky. The storm has been keeping people close to home, but once it clears, then we don't have time for me to heal properly, Rose said. We have to move while we still have the advantage of him thinking I'm dead. They spent the rest of that day planning, going over every detail of Martha's house and the layout of Bitter Hollow. Marcus drew maps in the dirt floor, showing Rose the safest routes in and out of town, the places where they could hide if they were discovered, the escape routes that would take them back into the high country, where Garrison's men would be reluctant to follow. Rose told him everything she could remember about Martha's habits and hiding places. The loose floorboard in the bedroom where she kept her small savings, the false bottom in the kitchen pantry where she stored her most valuable preserves, the old trunk in the attic that was filled with clothes and mementos from her dead husband. If Martha kept any evidence about my real identity, Rose said, it would be in that trunk. She used to go up there sometimes when she thought I was asleep, and I could hear her crying. I always thought she was mourning her husband, but now you think she was mourning your mother, Marcus finished. Rose nodded, and maybe planning for the day when the truth could finally come out. That night, as the storm finally began to show signs of weakening, Marcus sat by the fire and told Rose stories about Clara, about how they had met at a church social in Bitter Hollow, how she had been the most beautiful and intelligent woman he had ever encountered, about their courtship, conducted partly through letters when he was away working his claim in the mountains, about their wedding, a simple ceremony in the same church where Clara would later teach Sunday school to children of all backgrounds and colors. She was fearless, Marcus said, his voice soft with memory. Never met a cause she wouldn't fight for, or a person she wouldn't defend. Sometimes I worried that her big heart would get her into trouble, but I never imagined. He trailed off, staring into the flames. She sounds wonderful, Rose said quietly. She was. And if you are her daughter, our daughter, then you have her strength. I can see it in the way you survived that fall, in the way you're already planning to fight back instead of running away. Clara would be proud. Rose felt something warm unfold in her chest, a feeling she had never experienced before. The possibility of belonging to something, of being part of a family that had wanted her, that had fought for her, that had never stopped loving her even when they thought she was dead. What if we're wrong, she asked. What if I'm not your daughter? What if this is all just coincidence? Marcus looked at her for a long moment, his eyes reflecting the firelight. Then you're still a young woman who deserves justice for what was done to her. And I'm still a man who has nothing left to lose by fighting for what's right. Rose smiled, the first genuine smile she had managed since Martha's death. In that case, when do we leave for Bitter Hollow? Tomorrow night, Marcus said, when the moon is dark and honest folks are sleeping. We'll get the proof we need, and then we'll decide what to do with it. Outside, the wind was finally beginning to die down, and through the gaps in the storm clouds, a few stars were becoming visible. Rose fell asleep that night with the sound of Marcus's voice telling her stories about the mother she had never known she had. And for the first time in her life, she dreamed of a future that included more than just survival. She dreamed of a family. She dreamed of justice. And she dreamed of the day when the truth would finally set them all free. There are things buried in snow that don't melt come spring. Secrets, names, sins with no tombstones. And that morning, when the storm finally broke and pale sunlight struggled through the clouds for the first time in days, Marcus Sullivan realized it wasn't just a daughter he had found lying broken at the bottom of Eagle's Drop. He had dug up something much deeper, something colder than the mountain winter itself. He had uncovered a conspiracy that reached back 18 years and forward into a future that would be shaped by the choices he and Rose made in the coming days. Rose was sleeping when he made his decision, her breathing finally steady and deep instead of the shallow, painful gasps that had worried him through the long nights of her recovery. The swelling around her eyes had gone down enough that he could see Clara's features more clearly now, and there was no longer any doubt in his mind about who she was. She was his daughter, their daughter. The child he had mourned for 18 years was alive, breathing, healing in his own bed. The miracle of it should have filled him with nothing but joy. But Marcus Sullivan was a practical man who understood that miracles came with a price. Someone had stolen his daughter from him. Someone had murdered his wife. Someone had built a life and a career on the suffering of innocent people. And that someone was still in power, still causing harm, still believing that his secrets were safe. Marcus sat by the fire with a leather-bound ledger in his lap, one that Clara had used to keep household accounts during their brief marriage. Most of the pages were blank now, the domestic records of their life together having been lost along with everything else in the fire that wasn't really a fire, but the empty pages would serve a new purpose now. He turned to the first clean page and began to write names. Not just the names of the men who had thrown Rose from the cliff, but all the names that connected to the web of corruption that had destroyed his family and countless others over the years. He started with Sheriff Wade Garrison, writing the name slowly and deliberately, as if the act of putting it on paper was the first step in ensuring that justice would finally be served. Garrison had been a deputy 18 years ago, young and ambitious and already showing signs of the cruelty that would define his later career. Marcus remembered him clearly now, the way he had stood at Clara's funeral with his hat in his hands and his eyes dry, offering condolences that sounded rehearsed rather than heartfelt. Next came Reverend Solomon Cross, the man who had performed the funeral service for a coffin that held ashes and lies instead of his wife and child. Cross had spoken eloquently about God's mysterious ways and the comfort that could be found in accepting divine will, but his words had felt hollow even then. Now Marcus understood why. The preacher had been part of the deception from the beginning, using his position and authority to lend credibility to a story that fell apart under close examination. He added other names as they occurred to him. Deputy Hayes, who had been among the men who took Rose from Martha's house. Judge Blackwood, who had signed the death certificates for Clara and their child without ever examining any bodies. Dr. Morrison, who had supposedly treated the fire victims, but had been notably absent from the scene when Marcus arrived to identify his family. Each name was connected to the others by lines and notes that began to form a pattern, a map of corruption that reached into every level of local government and society. It wasn't just about Sheriff Garrison's personal cruelty or greed. It was about a system that protected men like him, that enabled their crimes, that profited from the suffering of those who had no power to fight back. But as Marcus wrote, he began to realize that names alone wouldn't be enough. Paper accusations could be dismissed, ignored, or destroyed. What he needed was evidence, documents, witnesses, proof that could stand up in a court of law, or at least in the court of public opinion. "You're making a list," Rose said from the bed, her voice still rough but stronger than it had been the night before. Marcus looked up to find her watching him, propped up on one elbow despite what must have been considerable pain. "Did I wake you?" "No, I've been awake for a while, just listening to you write." She managed a small smile. "You press hard with the pencil when you're angry." Marcus set the ledger aside and moved to check her injuries, noting with relief that the swelling around her eyes had continued to go down, and her breathing seemed easier. "How are you feeling?" "Like I fell off a mountain," Rose said dryly. "But better than yesterday. Good enough to travel, if that's what you're planning." "Not yet. You need at least another day or two before you're strong enough for what we're going to have to do." Rose struggled to sit up, accepting Marcus's help when he offered it. "What exactly are we going to have to do?" Marcus picked up the ledger again, showing her the names and connections he had been mapping out. "We're going to expose them. All of them. But first, we need proof that will convince people who have spent years believing their lies." Rose studied the pages, her expression growing darker as she read the names and understood the scope of what they were dealing with. "Martha's house isn't the only place where evidence might be hidden." "What do you mean?" "The mission," Rose said. "If Clara was keeping records of what she saw, if she was gathering evidence against Garrison and the others, then some of it might have survived the fire. Hidden somewhere they wouldn't think to look." Marcus frowned. "The mission was completely destroyed. I saw the ruins myself." "The main buildings, yes. But there were other structures. A smokehouse, a root cellar, a well house. Places that might have been overlooked when they were covering their tracks." Rose looked at him intently. "Clara was smart, right? If she knew she was in danger, she would have found a way to preserve her evidence somewhere safe." "It's possible," Marcus admitted. "But even if something survived, how would we know where to look? The mission covered several acres." Rose touched the cross at her throat, her expression thoughtful. "Martha used to tell me stories about my mother, about how brave she was, how she always found ways to help people even when it was dangerous. One story that always stuck with me was about how she saved some of the mission's food stores during a harsh winter by hiding them in places where the government inspectors wouldn't think to look." "What kind of places?" "Places that looked abandoned or useless. The old well that had gone dry, a storage shed that had supposedly burned down but was actually just carefully hidden. Clara was good at making things invisible when they needed to be." Marcus considered this, weighing the risks against the potential rewards. The mission ruins were closer to Bitter Hollow than his cabin, which meant there was a greater chance of being discovered. But they were also largely ignored. Most people avoided the site, considering it cursed or simply too painful to visit. "If we're going to search the mission," he said, "we'll need to do it before we attempt to get into Martha's house. Once we show ourselves in town, Garrison will know that you survived the fall. Our window of opportunity will close fast." Rose nodded. "Then we go tonight, as soon as it's dark enough to travel without being seen." They spent the rest of the day preparing for what might be a long and dangerous night. Marcus cleaned and loaded his rifle, checked his pistol, and made sure they had enough supplies to sustain them if they had to flee into the wilderness. Rose, despite her injuries, insisted on helping with the preparations, using her knowledge of the area to suggest routes and hiding places that would keep them away from well-traveled paths. As the sun set behind the peaks and darkness began to settle over the valley, Marcus helped Rose into her coat, one of his own, modified to fit her smaller frame, but still warm enough to protect her from the mountain cold. She moved carefully, favoring her injured ribs and left arm, but with more strength and determination than he would have thought possible for someone who had been near death just days before. "You sure you're ready for this?" he asked. Rose looked at him, and in her eyes he saw an echo of the same fierce determination that had driven Clara to risk everything in pursuit of justice. "I've been ready for this my whole life," she said. "I just didn't know what I was getting ready for." They rode out into the darkness together, two ghosts heading toward a place where the dead were supposed to rest, but where the truth was still waiting to be found. Behind them, the cabin sat empty and dark, but it no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like the beginning of something new, a reckoning that was 18 years overdue. The moon was only a thin sliver in the sky, providing just enough light to navigate by, but not enough to make them easily visible to anyone who might be watching. Marcus led the way on Thunder, with Rose riding behind him, her good arm wrapped around his waist for stability. They followed deer trails and creek beds, paths that would leave minimal tracks and were unlikely to be patrolled by Garrison's men. The ruins of the mission appeared before them, like the skeleton of some great beast, its burned timbers reaching toward the sky like blackened ribs. The main chapel was completely gone, reduced to a foundation of charred stones and memories. The dormitory where Clara had lived and worked was similarly destroyed, its roof collapsed and its walls fallen inward. But as Rose had predicted, some of the smaller outbuildings had survived, either because they were made of stone rather than wood, or because they had been far enough from the main fire to escape complete destruction. They dismounted at the edge of the ruins and approached on foot, moving carefully through the debris and overgrown vegetation that had begun to reclaim the site. Marcus carried a shuttered lantern that would provide light when they needed it, but could be quickly concealed if they heard anyone approaching. "Where do we start?" he whispered. Rose pointed toward a low stone structure near what had once been the mission's kitchen garden. The root cellar. If Clara hid something here, it would be somewhere she could access easily, but that wouldn't be obvious to anyone else. The root cellar was partially collapsed, its wooden door long since rotted away and its stone steps cracked and overgrown with weeds. But it was still accessible, and when Marcus uncovered the lantern, they could see that the interior space was larger than it appeared from the outside. They searched methodically, checking every stone and wooden beam for signs of a hiding place. It was Rose who found it, a loose stone in the back wall that could be removed to reveal a small cavity behind it. "Here," she said, her voice tight with excitement. Marcus held the lantern closer as Rose carefully reached into the hiding place and withdrew a wrapped bundle. Inside the oilcloth were several items that had been protected from moisture and decay: a journal bound in leather, a collection of letters tied with ribbon, and a small tin box that rattled when Rose shook it. They took their discoveries outside, finding a sheltered spot among the ruins, where they could examine what they had found without the lantern light being visible from a distance. The journal was filled with Clara's handwriting, neat, precise notes that documented months of careful observation and investigation. As they read by the dim light, a picture began to emerge of a conspiracy that was even more extensive than Marcus had imagined. Clara had indeed been keeping records of the government agents' treatment of the native families, but she had also stumbled across something else: evidence that Sheriff Garrison was working with corrupt officials to systematically remove young women from the area. Some were sold to brothels in distant cities. Others were forced into marriages with men who paid for the privilege of owning them. A few simply disappeared entirely, their fates unknown but almost certainly tragic. The letters were correspondence between Clara and various officials, including a territorial judge and a federal marshal, documenting her attempts to report what she had discovered through proper channels. The responses were either dismissive or threatening, making it clear that the corruption reached far beyond Bitter Hollow. But it was the contents of the tin box that provided the most damning evidence. Inside were photographs, crude but clear images of men conducting what appeared to be slave auctions, with young women standing on platforms while crowds of buyers looked on. In several of the photographs, Sheriff Garrison was clearly visible, as were other prominent citizens of Bitter Hollow and surrounding communities. "My God," Marcus breathed as he examined the images. She documented everything. "And they killed her for it," Rose said, her voice heavy with grief and anger. "No," Marcus said, looking up from the photographs. "They tried to kill her for it, but Clara was smarter than they gave her credit for. She hid this evidence where they would never think to look for it, and she made sure you survived to find it someday." Rose was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of what they had discovered. "What do we do with it now?" Marcus carefully rewrapped the evidence and tucked it inside his coat. "Now we go to Martha's house and see if she left anything that corroborates what Clara documented, and then we decide how to make sure the whole world knows what these men have done." They made their way back to their horses, moving carefully through the darkness, toward a town that held the answers to 18 years of questions. Behind them, the mission ruins settled back into silence, their secrets finally given up after nearly 2 decades of keeping faith with the dead. But ahead of them lay the most dangerous part of their mission, returning to the very place where Rose had been sentenced to death, where the men who had tried to destroy their family still held power, where one mistake could cost them not just their lives, but any chance of seeing justice done. As they rode toward Bitter Hollow, Marcus found himself thinking about the photographs in his coat pocket, about the evidence that Clara had died to preserve, about the daughter who had survived against all odds to help him complete her mother's work. The dead might rest easier soon, he thought. But first, there was a reckoning to be had with the living. The town of Bitter Hollow looked different in the darkness, smaller somehow, as if the shadows had revealed its true dimensions after years of hiding behind false grandeur. What seemed solid and permanent in daylight now appeared fragile, temporary, like a stage set that could be dismantled with enough force applied in the right places. Marcus and Rose approached from the north, following a route that would take them past the cemetery and through the stand of cottonwoods that bordered Martha Coleman's property. The boarding house sat on the edge of town, which made it easier to reach without being seen, but also meant they would have farther to travel if they needed to escape quickly. Rose rode behind Marcus in tense silence, every shadow potentially hiding one of Garrison's men, every sound possibly signaling their discovery. Her ribs ached with each of Thunder's steps, and her left arm throbbed where the makeshift splint pressed against her injuries, but she forced herself to ignore the pain. There would be time to hurt later, after they had found what they came for. Martha's house stood dark and silent, its windows boarded up and its front door sealed with a notice of property seizure signed by Judge Blackwood. Someone had been through the place already. They could see evidence of a hasty search in the way furniture had been moved and belongings scattered. But Rose was counting on the fact that whoever had conducted the search hadn't known Martha the way she did. They left Thunder tied to a tree in the small grove behind the house, far enough away that his presence wouldn't be immediately obvious, but close enough that they could reach him quickly if necessary. Marcus carried his rifle and the shuttered lantern, while Rose led the way to the back entrance she knew would be easiest to open without making noise. The kitchen door had been forced at some point, probably by whoever had searched the house, and it swung open on hinges that squeaked like dying mice. Inside, the familiar smells of Martha's home, lavender soap, dried herbs, the lingering aroma of countless meals cooked with love, had been tainted by the mustiness of abandonment and the sharp scent of men who had come looking for secrets. Rose led Marcus through the kitchen and up the narrow staircase to the second floor, where Martha's bedroom and the attic access were located. Every step seemed to echo in the silence, despite their efforts to move quietly. The house felt wrong somehow, as if Martha's death had left more than just an empty space, as if something essential had been torn out of the very walls. Martha's bedroom had been thoroughly ransacked. The mattress had been cut open and its stuffing scattered across the floor. Drawers had been pulled out and overturned. Even the floorboards had been pried up in several places, leaving gaps like missing teeth in the wooden floor. They were looking for something specific, Marcus observed, keeping his voice low. But they didn't find it, Rose said with more confidence than she felt. Martha was too smart to hide anything important in obvious places. She moved to the corner of the room where a narrow ladder led up to the attic access. The opening above was dark and uninviting, and Rose hesitated for a moment before beginning to climb. Her injured ribs protested with each rung, but she gritted her teeth and continued upward. The attic was a cramped space under the eaves, filled with the accumulated possessions of a lifetime. Trunks and boxes were stacked along the walls, covered with dust and cobwebs that suggested they hadn't been disturbed by the searchers below. Rose made her way carefully across the uneven floorboards to the trunk she remembered from her childhood. An old wooden chest that Martha had claimed contained nothing but her late husband's belongings. The trunk was locked, but Rose knew where Martha kept the key, tucked inside a small cloth bag that was sewn to the underside of the trunk's lid. Her fingers fumbled with the tiny clasp, hampered by the darkness in her injured arm. But finally the lock clicked open. Inside, beneath a layer of carefully folded men's clothing that did indeed belong to Martha's deceased husband, Rose found what she was looking for. A leather document case that contained papers Martha had been keeping for nearly 18 years. Marcus held the lantern close as Rose carefully removed and examined each document. There were birth records, her birth records, showing that she had been born Rose Clara Sullivan to Marcus Sullivan and Clara Elizabeth Sullivan at the missionary station outside Bitter Hollow. There was a copy of her parents' marriage certificate proving that their union had been legal and recognized by territorial law. But most importantly, there was a detailed letter in Martha's handwriting, addressed to Rose and dated just a month before Martha's death. In it, Martha explained everything: how she had been at the mission the night Clara was killed, how she had helped Clara hide Rose in the root cellar before the murderers arrived, how she had taken the baby and fled to town while the mission burned behind them. Martha had witnessed Clara's murder. She had seen Sheriff Garrison and 2 other men arrive at the mission after dark, demanding that Clara turn over the evidence she had been gathering. When Clara refused, they had beaten her and set fire to the buildings to cover their crime. But Clara had hidden Rose so well that even Martha had almost missed finding her. Following the sound of crying to the root cellar where Clara had placed her daughter, along with the silver cross and a letter that had been lost in the intervening years. The letter went on to explain how Martha had spent 18 years living in fear, knowing that if Garrison ever discovered Rose's true identity, he would kill them both to protect his secrets. She had raised Rose as her own daughter, teaching her to be strong and independent, preparing her for the day when the truth would finally come to light. She knew, Rose whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks as she read. She knew who I was from the beginning, and she still risked everything to protect me. Marcus placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. She loved you. Both of your mothers loved you enough to sacrifice their lives to keep you safe. They gathered the documents carefully, wrapping them in the same oilcloth that had protected Clara's evidence at the mission ruins. Combined with the journal and photographs they had already found, they now had enough proof to expose the conspiracy that had destroyed so many lives over the years. But as they prepared to leave the attic, they heard a sound that made them both freeze: the creak of floorboards downstairs, followed by the low murmur of voices. Someone was in the house. Marcus extinguished the lantern immediately, plunging them into darkness. They sat motionless in the cramped attic space, hardly daring to breathe as the sounds from below grew louder. At least 3 men, maybe more, moving through the house with the confidence of people who had every right to be there. "Search it again," said a voice that Rose recognized with a chill of fear. Sheriff Garrison himself was below them, directing his men in another search of Martha's property. The girl survived the fall, which means she might have made it back here. If Coleman left anything that could implicate us, we need to find it before anyone else does. "We already tore this place apart, Sheriff," replied another voice, Deputy Hayes by the sound of it. "If there was anything here, we would have found it." "Then tear it apart again," Garrison snapped. "Check every board, every brick, every inch of this place. And if you find any sign that the girl has been here, you track her down and finish what we started at Eagle's Drop." The sound of renewed searching echoed through the house. Furniture being moved, floorboards being pried up, walls being tapped to check for hidden compartments. Rose and Marcus remained motionless in their hiding place, knowing that any sound could give them away and result in their immediate capture. Hours passed, or what felt like hours in the darkness and tension of their concealment. Finally, the sounds below began to diminish, and they heard Garrison's voice again, closer now, as if he were standing directly beneath the attic access. "Nothing," he said, his frustration evident. "But keep men watching the place. If she's alive, she'll come back here eventually." Women always return to what they think of as home. The men left the way they had come, through the forced kitchen door, their voices fading as they moved away from the house. But Marcus and Rose remained hidden for another hour, making sure that no one had been left behind to watch for their return. When they finally climbed down from the attic, Rose's legs were cramped and her injuries were screaming in protest. But she also felt a fierce satisfaction. They had gotten what they came for, and Garrison's men had searched the house thoroughly without finding any trace of their presence. The ride back to Marcus's cabin took them through the darkest hours of the night, when even the nocturnal creatures of the forest seemed to be sleeping. They didn't speak during the journey, both lost in their own thoughts about what they had learned and what they needed to do next. It wasn't until they were safely back in the warm cabin, with the evidence spread out on the table before them, that Rose finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what they had discovered. "We have enough to destroy them," she said, looking at the documents and photographs that represented 18 years of careful planning and sacrifice. "Clara's journal, Martha's letter, the birth records that prove who I am. It's all here." Marcus nodded, but his expression was troubled. "The question is what we do with it. Garrison has allies in the territorial government, judges and officials who are either corrupt or intimidated. If we simply turn this evidence over to the authorities, it might disappear before it ever sees the light of day." Rose considered this, thinking about the men who had tried to auction her like livestock, who had murdered the women who had raised her, who had built their power on the suffering of countless innocents. "Then we don't go through official channels," she said. "We make it public. We find a way to get this information to every newspaper, every territorial official, every citizen who has the power to demand justice." "That's dangerous," Marcus warned. "Once we go public, there's no going back. Garrison and his allies will stop at nothing to silence us." Rose looked at him steadily, seeing in his face the same determination that had driven Clara to risk everything for the truth. "They already tried to silence me once. They murdered my mother and destroyed my family. They've caused enough pain, hurt enough people. It ends now." Marcus studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then we'll need help. People we can trust, who have the resources and connections to get this information where it needs to go. Do you know anyone like that?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, thinking. "There's a federal marshal named William Crawford who's been investigating territorial corruption for years. He's based in Denver, but he's been asking questions about activities in this region. If we can get this evidence to him, he has the authority and the protection to act on it. How do we reach him?" "The telegraph office in Cedar Falls. It's a 2-day ride from here, but it's outside Garrison's immediate sphere of influence. We can send a coded message requesting a meeting, then turn over the evidence when he arrives." Rose felt a spark of hope, the first she had experienced since this nightmare began. "When do we leave?" "Tomorrow night," Marcus said. "We'll need time to plan the route and gather supplies. And you need time to rest and heal as much as possible before we attempt another long journey." They spent the remaining hours before dawn organizing the evidence and planning their next move. Marcus wrote out a careful message to Marshal Crawford, explaining in general terms what they had discovered and requesting an urgent meeting. Rose studied maps of the territory, memorizing routes and landmarks that would help them avoid Garrison's men during their journey to Cedar Falls. As the sun rose over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Rose found herself standing at the cabin window, looking out at the valley that had been her prison and was now becoming her path to freedom. "Clara would be proud of you," Marcus said softly, coming to stand beside her. Rose touched the silver cross at her throat, feeling the rough edges where her father had shaped it with his own hands so many years ago. "She gave me more than just life," she said. "She gave me the truth, and Martha gave me the strength to use it." "And what will you give the world?" Rose smiled, the first truly happy expression she had worn since before Martha's death. "Justice," she said, "for all of them, for everyone who was silenced, everyone who was forgotten, everyone who was told their lives didn't matter." She turned to look at Marcus, seeing not just the father she had never known she had, but the partner she needed to complete the work that Clara had started 18 years ago. "They tried to bury the truth with lies and violence," she said, "but the truth has a way of growing in dark places, of finding the light no matter how deep it's planted. And once it breaks the surface, nothing can stop it from spreading." Outside, the mountain valley was waking up to a new day, and somewhere in the distance the sound of church bells could be heard from Bitter Hollow, calling the faithful to worship. But Rose and Marcus knew that the real reckoning was still to come, and when it arrived, it would shake the foundations of everything that corrupt men had built on the suffering of others. The silence was about to be broken. The truth was about to be told, and the girl they had tried to throw away like garbage was about to show them what real power looked like. The ride to Cedar Falls took them through some of the most beautiful country in the Colorado Territory. High meadows carpeted with wildflowers, crystal streams that tumbled down from snow-capped peaks, forests of aspen that shimmered like coins in the mountain breeze. Under different circumstances, it might have been a pleasure journey, a chance for a father and daughter to get to know each other while exploring the wilderness that had shaped both their lives. But Rose and Marcus rode with the constant awareness that they were being hunted, that somewhere behind them, Sheriff Garrison's men were following their trail, determined to prevent the truth from reaching the outside world. They traveled mostly at night, sleeping during the day in hidden camps where they could rest without being easily discovered. They avoided main roads and well-traveled trails, following deer paths and creek beds that would make their route harder to predict. Rose's injuries made the journey more difficult than it needed to be. Her ribs still ached with every movement, and her left arm was weak and unreliable despite the healing that had taken place. But she never complained, never asked to slow down or rest more frequently. She understood as well as Marcus did that time was working against them, that every hour of delay increased the chance that Garrison would find a way to stop them. On the morning of the second day, as they made camp in a grove of cottonwoods beside a small stream, Rose finally asked the question that had been troubling her since they left the cabin. "What happens after we turn over the evidence?" she said. "Even if Marshal Crawford believes us, even if he's able to arrest Garrison and the others, what happens to us? We can't go back to Bitter Hollow, and I don't know anywhere else that feels like home." Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering the question. He had been wondering the same thing himself, trying to imagine a future beyond the immediate goal of seeing justice done. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've spent so many years focused on just surviving each day that I haven't thought much about what comes after survival." Rose nodded, understanding. Martha used to say that sometimes the hardest part of fighting isn't the battle itself, but figuring out what to do when the fighting is over. "Smart woman," Marcus said. "She raised you well, considering the circumstances." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sound of the stream and the wind in the trees. Finally, Rose spoke again. "I've been thinking about what Clara wrote in her journal," she said, "about the work she was doing at the mission, trying to help people who had no one else to speak for them. Maybe that's what comes after. Maybe we use what we've learned to help other people who are in the same situation we were in." Marcus looked at her with interest. "What do you mean?" "There are other towns like Bitter Hollow," Rose said. "Other places where corrupt officials prey on people who have no power to fight back. Other women and children who need someone to stand up for them when they can't stand up for themselves." The idea had been growing in Rose's mind during their journey, fed by her reading of Clara's journal and her own experiences with injustice. She had spent her entire life feeling powerless, at the mercy of forces beyond her control. But now, with the truth on her side and Marcus beside her, she was beginning to understand that power wasn't something that was given to you by others. It was something you claimed for yourself. "You want to become some kind of traveling advocates?" Marcus asked. "Going from town to town, looking for corruption to expose?" "Why not?" Rose said. We've already proven that the system doesn't protect people like us. Maybe it's time we protected ourselves. Marcus considered this, imagining a life spent moving from place to place, never settling down but always working towards something meaningful. It wasn't the future he might have chosen for himself a few weeks ago, but then again, a few weeks ago he had been a broken man living alone in the wilderness, mourning the loss of a family he thought was dead forever. It would be dangerous, he said. Everything worthwhile is dangerous, Rose replied. Clara knew that when she started documenting what she saw at the mission. Martha knew that when she agreed to raise me and keep the secret, they were willing to take risks because they believed in something bigger than their own safety. And what do you believe in? Rose was quiet for a moment, thinking about everything that had happened to her, everything she had learned about herself and her family and the world they lived in. I believe in the truth, she said finally. I believe that people have the right to live without fear of those who are supposed to protect them. And I believe that sometimes the only way to change things is to refuse to stay quiet when staying quiet would be easier. Marcus smiled, seeing in her words an echo of the woman who had given her life rather than surrender the evidence that would eventually set her daughter free. Then I guess we'll see where the truth takes us, he said. They reached Cedar Falls late in the afternoon of their second day of travel, arriving at a town that was larger and more prosperous than Bitter Hollow, but still small enough that strangers attracted attention. The telegraph office was located on the main street, next to a bank and across from a hotel that looked like it might offer decent accommodations for travelers with enough money to pay for them. Marcus sent the coded message to Marshal Crawford, while Rose waited outside with the horses, her hat pulled low to conceal her face. The reply came back within 2 hours. Crawford would meet them at the hotel the following evening, and he was bringing a team of federal agents with him. That night, in a clean hotel room with real beds and hot water for washing, Rose allowed herself to feel hopeful for the first time since Martha's death. Tomorrow they would turn over the evidence that Clara and Martha had died to preserve. Justice might finally be within reach. But even as she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that their real work was just beginning. Exposing Garrison and his co-conspirators would be satisfying, but it would only address one small corner of a much larger problem. There were other corrupt officials in other towns, other innocent people who needed someone to speak for them. Maybe, Rose thought as sleep finally claimed her, that someone could be her. The meeting with Marshal Crawford took place the next evening in a private dining room at the hotel. Crawford was a tall, lean man in his 50s, with gray hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail of his surroundings. He was accompanied by 2 other federal agents and a stenographer who would record their testimony for use in future legal proceedings. Marcus and Rose took turns telling their story, starting with Marcus's marriage to Clara and the events surrounding the supposed fire at the mission, continuing through Rose's childhood in Bitter Hollow and the recent events that had led to their discovery of the truth. They presented the evidence methodically: Clara's journal, the photographs, Martha's letter, the birth records that proved Rose's identity. Crawford and his team listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. When Rose and Marcus finished their account, Crawford sat back in his chair and was quiet for several minutes, clearly processing the implications of what he had heard. "This is extensive," he said finally. "More extensive than anything we've uncovered in our previous investigations. If even half of what you've documented is accurate, we're looking at a conspiracy that reaches into multiple levels of territorial government." "It's all accurate," Rose said firmly. "Every word, every photograph, every document. These men destroyed my family and countless others. They need to be held accountable for what they've done." Crawford nodded. "They will be. But I need you to understand that this process will take time. We'll need to conduct our own investigation, gather additional evidence, build cases that will stand up in federal court. It could be months before we're ready to make arrests." "What about our safety in the meantime?" Marcus asked. "Garrison knows that Rose survived his attempt to kill her. He'll be looking for us." "We can offer you federal protection," Crawford said. "Safe houses, new identities if necessary. But it would mean staying in hiding until the trials are over." Rose and Marcus exchanged a look, communicating without words. They had discussed this possibility during their journey to Cedar Falls, and they had already decided what their answer would be. "We appreciate the offer," Rose said, "but we have other work to do." Crawford raised an eyebrow. "What kind of work?" "The kind that Clara started," Rose replied. "There are other towns, other situations where people need someone to document what's happening and make sure the truth gets told. We can't hide while there are still people who need help." "That's extremely dangerous," one of the other agents said. "If Garrison's network is as extensive as you suggest, word of your activities will spread quickly. You'll be targets wherever you go." Rose smiled, the same fearless expression that Marcus had seen Clara wear when she was facing down opposition to her work at the mission. "They can try to silence us," she said, "but the truth doesn't depend on any one person to tell it. Clara proved that when she hid the evidence where I could find it 18 years later. Martha proved it when she kept the secret and raised me to be strong enough to finish what my mother started." Crawford studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I can see why your mother was willing to die for what she believed in," he said. "You have the same fire in you." "I hope so," Rose said, "because there's a lot of work left to be done." They left Cedar Falls the next morning, riding west toward the setting sun and an uncertain future. Behind them, Crawford and his team were already beginning the process that would eventually bring down Sheriff Garrison and his co-conspirators. Ahead of them lay a world full of injustice and corruption, but also full of opportunities to make a difference. As they rode, Marcus found himself thinking about the conversation they had shared beside the stream, about Rose's vision of using their experience to help others who found themselves in similar situations. It wasn't the quiet retirement he might have imagined for himself, but then again, he had learned that the most important things in life were rarely the ones you planned for. "Where do we go first?" one he asked. Rose considered the question, thinking about the stories they had heard during their journey, the rumors and whispers that suggested other towns with other problems. "South," she said finally. "There's a place called Redemption Creek where the territorial governor's nephew is supposed to be the sheriff. Word is that young women have been disappearing from there for years, but no one seems to want to investigate too closely." Marcus nodded. "Redemption Creek it is." They rode in comfortable silence for a while. Father and daughter finally united after 18 years of separation, embarking on a mission that would honor the memory of the women who had sacrificed everything to make this moment possible. Behind them, the mountains rose like monuments to endurance and strength. Ahead of them, the prairie stretched toward horizons that held both danger and hope in equal measure. And somewhere in between, the truth continued to grow, spreading like wildflower seeds on the wind, taking root wherever it found soil prepared by courage and watered by the blood of those who had refused to stay silent. Rose McKenna had survived a fall that should have killed her. She had discovered her true identity and exposed the corruption that had shaped her entire life. But most importantly, she had learned that the real power to change the world belonged not to those who held official positions or controlled institutions, but to those who were willing to speak truth to power, no matter the cost. The girl they had tried to throw away like garbage had become a woman who would spend the rest of her life ensuring that no one else would be thrown away again. And that, perhaps, was the greatest justice of all. Years later, when historians tried to piece together the events that led to the great territorial corruption trials of 1887, they would find scattered references to a man and woman who traveled from town to town, documenting injustices and gathering evidence that somehow always found its way to the right authorities at the right time. Some called them vigilantes, others called them angels. But those who had been helped by their interventions knew them simply as the truth-tellers, the ones who showed up when hope seemed lost and who never left until justice had been served. Rose and Marcus Sullivan became legends in their own time, though they never sought fame or recognition for their work. They were content to move quietly through the world, speaking for those who had no voice, documenting truths that powerful people wanted to keep hidden, ensuring that the light of justice reached even the darkest corners of the frontier. Sheriff Wade Garrison was eventually arrested and tried for multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and corruption. He died in territorial prison 3 years later, reportedly killed by another inmate who had lost a daughter to Garrison's trafficking network. Reverend Cross fled the territory and was never seen again. Judge Blackwood was removed from office and spent his remaining years as a broken man, drinking away his guilt in saloons from Denver to San Francisco. But perhaps the most fitting monument to Clara's memory was not the downfall of her killers, but the work that her daughter continued in her name. Rose never married, though she had opportunities. She was too committed to the mission she had inherited, too aware of how much work remained to be done. Marcus stayed by her side until the end, serving as her protector, her partner, and most importantly, her father. He found in their shared mission a purpose that had been missing from his life since Clara's death, and in Rose's fierce dedication to justice. He saw the best qualities of both the women he had loved. They are buried side by side in a small cemetery outside Denver, their simple headstones bearing only their names and the words they spoke for the voiceless. But their real memorial is not carved in stone. It's written in the lives of the countless people they helped, the corruption they exposed, the truths they preserved for future generations. The silence that had once ruled places like Bitter Hollow was broken forever, replaced by the sound of voices raised in defense of justice, truth, and human dignity. And though the West continued to be a harsh and often unforgiving place, it was also a place where ordinary people could stand up against extraordinary evil and win. Because sometimes that's all it takes to change the world. One person willing to speak the truth, no matter how dangerous that truth might be. One person willing to refuse to stay quiet, even when staying quiet would be safer. One person willing to believe that justice, however delayed, will eventually find its way to the light. This story of Rose McKenna reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's finding your voice when the world tries to silence you. It's choosing truth over comfort, justice over peace, and standing up even when you stand alone. If Rose's strength touched your heart, if Marcus's journey from despair to redemption moved you, or if this tale of breaking free from the chains of silence resonated with your soul, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever had to find your voice when others wanted you silent? What would you have done in Rose's situation? These stories matter because they remind us that the human spirit, tested, broken, but never defeated, can overcome any mountain, any storm, any silence that tries to bury the truth. Don't forget to hit that like button if this story moved you, and subscribe to Wild West Stories for more tales of courage, justice, and the unbreakable bonds of family. Ring that notification bell so you never miss a story of hope conquering despair on the American frontier. Your support helps us keep telling these important stories, these reminders that even in the darkest times, there are always people willing to stand up for what's right. Thank you for watching, and remember, the truth may be buried for a while, but it never stays buried forever. Until next time, keep the courage burning bright.